Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to wait a little bit for everyone to keep getting signed in, but as we do, feel free to jump into the chat if you want to introduce yourself. Let us know where you're joining us from, what your position is, and as a bonus, if you have a favorite Own Voices graphic novel, you could also add that in when you introduce yourself.
Yeah, my TBR pile isn't long enough. I need lots more.
Wow, someone all the way from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Tim Smythe. He's gonna be doing a panel and a session tomorrow, so yay. There's also a Q&A area if you have any questions you want to pose to the panelists. We'll be doing Q&A at the end. So anything as it comes up along the way, you can type it into the Q&A window. We're not really going to be pulling questions from the chat window, but you're welcome to chat amongst yourselves there. All right, looks like we've pretty much leveled out with the number of attendees, so we can go ahead and get started.
Awesome. I'm excited to jump right in. Thank you so much for joining us today for this panel about the importance of own voices in graphic novels. My name is Suzanne Sannwald, and I'll be moderating today. I'm a high school teacher librarian from San Diego County, and we have an amazing group of creators that I know you're all excited to hear from. I also want to give a special shout out to Sarah Smith and CSLA for coordinating this amazing panel, along with Katie Sines from Oni Press. So I'm going to just quickly introduce who we have here, and then we can jump right into hearing from them. So first off, we have Jonathan Hill, who is an award-winning cartoonist who lives in Portland, Oregon, and also teaches comics at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. Make sure to check out his first two books. I have them right here, Americus and Wild Weather, that he created with writer M.K. Reed, as well as Odessa, which is the first book he has written and drawn himself, and that I recommend to anyone who enjoys a good post-apocalyptic read. Next up, we have Mai Win, who is a comics maker, illustrator, and self-described ice cream enthusiast living in Northern California. She previously published two short stories, Coral and the King and Little Ghost, which you can check out on her website. And her book that you can go out to buy for your libraries right now is Pilu of the Woods. John Ira Jennings is a professor of media and cultural studies at UC Riverside, and he's part of so many projects when I was researching him. I'm not going to list them all now, but I do highly recommend. I enjoyed The Blacker the Ink, Constructions of the Black Identity in Comics and Sequential Art if you're into a really good academic read. Black Comics Returns, and the graphic novel adaptations, which I was really excited about, of Octavia Butler's Kindred and Parable of the Sower. He's also the curator of the Abrams Comic Arts Megascope line, which publishes creators of color. So make sure that you check out Megascope. Next up, we have Yehudi Mercado, who is a former Disney art director turned successful graphic novelist. His original graphic novels include Buffalo Speedway, Pantalones TX, Rocket Salvage, and Sci-Fu Kick It Off. Keep an eye out for his future works too, and I'm particularly excited about his upcoming middle grade graphic memoir, Chunky, which sounds amazing. And you may also want to check out, he's part of this comics anthology, Puerto Rico Strong, that the whole entire anthology was amazing. And then finally, but definitely, you'll be excited to hear from him, is Rodney Barnes. He is an award-winning Hollywood writer and producer of Wu-Tang: An American Saga, Marvel's Runaways, and Star's American Gods, to name a few. I do have to say I was particularly geeking out, and my son too, because he recently discovered the Boondocks that he worked on the animated series. And he has authored graphic novels, including Quincredible, Star Wars Lando, which I have right here, Falcon for Marvel Comics, and he's also now writing Philadelphia for Image Comics, which is amazing. Like, it's so, the art, and he worked on the writing, it's definitely incredible. Kind of gritty, so if you have younger students, it may not be for your school library, but you should check it out. So, as you can tell, we have an absolutely amazing lineup, and I want to dive right in so that you can hear directly from them. We're going to start with a fun little icebreaker so that you can also maybe share a little bit about one of your works. So for each of the panelists, I want to give you a chance to summarize the storyline of one of your works in 7 words or less. That's a good challenge.
7 words. Oh, that's so terrible. All right, hold on.
All right, I got mine.
Go for it.
Okay. This is about sci-fu. It's a hip hop, sci-fi, kung fu musical set in the 80s.
Very cool.
Are you calling on folks or are we just going?
Either way, are you ready to go, Jonathan? I know
Yeah.
I would need time to think of it if I didn't already have mine picked out. Are you ready, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think just for Odessa, kids go looking for mom. That's 5. So I have 2 words to spare. I don't know what I'd throw in there. The end.
It's or less, so you're totally fine.
Okay.
John?
I mean, okay, I got 7 words. It's very complex, but it's like Chicago detective deals with her dark past. Which is...
Which book was that
It's
with?
start for a log line. Something like it.
I'll go next. Quickredible is a neighborhood kid that's indestructible. Oh God, I think I'm at 4. That's trying to save New Orleans. That's probably 8. Please don't disqualify me.
That's awesome.
It's After the Rain, though. I'm sorry. So.
For my book, Peel of the Woods, I have 2 girls find their way home.
And I will have to say, I personally think that would be the hardest question to answer. So you got that one out of the way. So since this is a panel about own voices, and for people who maybe aren't familiar with that term, it's just a term to indicate a shared identity between the creator and their work. So if you're able to share in whatever way you feel comfortable, how you identify, as well as what your experience was growing up, whether you saw or you didn't see Own Voices works that reflected your identity. I can let people jump in if they feel ready to, or let me know if you'd prefer me to call on people.
I'll just say I think calling on people works better in Zoom because we're not like if we're on a panel together, it'd be easier to be like, oh hey, speak up. But I think in Zoom, calling on people definitely works better.
Okay. I'll start with you then, Jonathan. You can go for it.
No, I did not. That was not my.
I knew it.
But I guess so. Wait, what was the question? It was like.
So yeah, how would you identify? How do you identify? And also, what was your experience growing up, and if you saw Own Voices representation or not?
I mean, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and so I'm Vietnamese American. So I don't. There wasn't a lot. I mean, there was the kid from Short Run, and then he was in Temple of Doom. He was like the only Vietnamese kid I ever saw growing up in media. And then Dustin Nguyen in 21 Jump Street, I think. But like books or anything, or like I think that the biggest thing for me is like all the things I saw, except for those 2 kids, and then not counting Asian Americans in general, was just like everything is in relation to the war, but it's also America's experience in relation to the war. So it's like white-centered experiences where like, but the thing is like I grew up, I'm Vietnamese American, but I grew up in sort of the dominant culture. So, like I didn't grow up around other Vietnamese kids because I grew up in like the Midwest and stuff. And so I didn't really have any. And so I think that my Own Voices experience is that I think I struggled growing up until very recently being like, I'm too Asian to be white, but I'm too white to be Asian. You know what I mean? Like that was sort of like my struggle growing up.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruptions with my school bell and then my phone. I try to silence those. John, how about, could you go next?
Should I not have said I didn't hear it? I'm just kidding. Anyway, yeah, so I'm Black American. I'm from the South. I was born in 1970, so post civil rights era, Southern. So Mississippi is let's just say that my state has racism down to like a exact science. It's like perfection, in Mississippi. So so I came up in that space, an agrarian space, poor, almost like stereotypical to a certain degree. I literally grew up in the middle of a cotton field, which is, that's how people think about it, but it's like that's what happened. So I didn't really start thinking about representation until much later. And I think it's because of racist systems in that particular space are so ubiquitous and perfectly formed that it's kind of like being a fish in water, you know what I'm saying? And then I think I just read comics like a super early age, and my mom was an avid reader of many things, some appropriate, some inappropriate. I started reading horror at a very early age, I'm a massive horror fan. And I don't think that I really started thinking about representation in comics or what I was seeing. I mean, my favorite superhero character is still Daredevil because, I still like have an affinity for just how Matt Murdock is constructed, I think maybe like 1980 when Captain Marvel, Monica Rambeau was introduced with her afro, and she just reminded me of my mom, and I think that's when I started thinking about, what I was seeing on the page a lot more. And I really wasn't thinking about representation explicitly until I got to grad school, because up until that point, as Jonathan was saying, I was still in the dominant culture, so to speak. I went to HBCU, went to Jackson State. So the constituency there is like 99.99% Black. So when I went to University of Illinois, that's when I realized that, oh, wait a minute, I kind of am a minority and there is an erasure of my culture, right? And I think that's what started to politicize me around representation. And I was teaching visual culture later. So those are the things that kind of came together as as far as like pedagogy, critical making, and then how I was looking at myself in this medium, And also too, comics are great. So I was like, how do I merge all these together into one thing? So yeah. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
You also addressed it was just about whether or not you saw yourself represented in growing up.
Yeah, and so that's kind of what lit a fire under me as far as like the kind of work I want to do. As far as like the conventions that I co-founded and stuff like that. I don't want kids coming up behind me to feel like I felt. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How about you up next?
I'm Japanese American and Vietnamese American. So my dad's Vietnamese, my mom is Japanese. I grew up in the Bay Area in California where, it is pretty diverse, especially my high school was like a lot of Asian kids. But I still felt like sort of this gap in representation in media, especially the books I read. Like I had access to diverse books, but they were always not in the genre of my choice. So, things about historical repression, like Farewell to Manzanar or, Joy Luck Club, things like that. Not necessarily what I wanted to read as a 7th or 8th grader. I wanted like fantasy and sci-fi, but the characters look like me. So that's definitely where I felt this like very visible, very apparent gap and like something I wish I had and I wish I grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yehudi.
I'm Mexican Jew, born in Mexico City, grew up in Houston, Texas. Definitely did not see anything represented in the culture. The closest thing was probably the sitcom Welcome Back, Kotter with the Juan Epstein, the Puerto Rican Jew. Like that was always like the touch point I would tell people, because like when I'd say Mexican Jew, people were like, what? Cannot compute. Like they act like that's the craziest thing they've ever heard. Like, so, from an early age, I had to grasp whatever I could in other cultures. And I was a latchkey kid. So basically grew up on TV, TV and reading comic books like after school. So, from an early age, I was trying to create my own little comics with like Mexican characters and Jewish characters. Just because it was like, if I don't, like, I'm not going to see it anywhere else. Like, and that's sort of what, and I would, I am into animation and I create animated stuff, but like, that's the kind of the reason why I went into graphic novels, is because like I would pitch these shows with Mexicans and Jewish characters and like, nah, they're not going to go anywhere. So that's when I channeled all of that into graphic novels and sort of creating my own content. And yeah.
Thank you. And then Rodney.
Yeah, so growing up, my mother was a school teacher in Annapolis, Maryland. And this was before the age of computers because I'm like really old. And she would take me to the public library when she would do her lesson plan. So I would spend the whole day reading. And I was a big fan of like the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew mysteries and stuff like that. But they never had any kids in them that were like me. And, I too spent a lot of time watching television. I love Scooby-Doo. I love the Saturday morning cartoons that no longer exist. And very rarely, unless it was like Fat Albert, that was the only outlier. But other than him, there wasn't a lot of, there weren't a lot of folks that looked like me, weren't a lot of kids doing things that I could actually relate to. And even in comics, the early Black Panther or Luke Cage stuff, it always felt like they were fighting, like Black Panther was fighting the KKK or Luke Cage was sticking it to the man. They were like blaxploitation movies a little bit. They were rarely like adventures like Spider-Man where they were just fighting a guy every once in a while. But very rarely did I see any type of representation that felt personal to me. So when the opportunity came, doing stuff like Everybody Hates Chris, things that were about a kid, I sort of gravitated to. And even with Quincredible, I wanted to write an adventure that felt like the Hardy Boys, like it was something that was fun, that was just about what it was about. Still set in a world that at times can be problematic, but still fun underneath all of it, so that you could lose yourself in an adventure and not necessarily be reminded of what's going on in the world.
Thank you. When John was talking and ending with wanting to create stories, maybe that all of you say, shared maybe a similar experience of not having seen your own identity reflected as a child, but now having this opportunity to create works that perhaps other young people can see themselves represented in. I'm not going to call on all, like for the remainder of the questions, I'm thinking we don't necessarily have to hear everybody speak on each question, but if you feel like really excited to answer it, I'll kind of gauge by your expressions and call on you. But do you have any stories that stand out to you about people who have read or enjoyed your works and express the impact that you've had on them in terms of the content of your work or them seeing you as a creator?
Well, I want to piggyback a little bit what Rodney was saying, like making stories that are fun. Like that's definitely been my driving sort of force, because it's like, yeah, and on this, like I went to a filmmaking workshop like for Latinos, and I remember the keynote speaker was like, hey, enough about border crossing, enough about illegal immigrants. Like that's all we see of like Mexican culture is like the sneaking across the border like stories. Is like enough of that. Like I want to see a John Hughes comedy, like high school comedy that happens to have Latino. So like that left a big impression on me. So like all the things I do are fun, action, adventure, that they're not colorblind. Like there's definitely a reason why they are Latino or Jewish. But it's fun. It's wish fulfillment, because like I also work I used to work in video games, and they would say that video games are wish fulfillment. So that's kind of what the energy I also brought into like my middle grade graphic novels. It's wish fulfillment. It's like you don't want to be constantly reminded of the oppression, and like, but you can't, you don't ignore it. Like have that feed into the character, but like that's not fun to like just constantly be told you're oppressed.
Yeah, and I think even from an educator's point of view, it's kind of cool to see that this conversation or line of thinking is going on in the arts at the same time that we're having very similar educational conversations about this. There's been a lot of focus on the work of Dr. Goldie Mohammed lately in education circles, and she writes about and speaks about not just teaching to the oppression. So for instance, when people are building collections, not that you're ignoring history or the impact that history has had. So making sure to teach students about difficult history, but also finding ways to celebrate excellence of different people and finding ways to see joy of them. And having read the stories that, like I've tried to read from all of your stories, I definitely saw that coming out in the works that you have created. And so along those lines, do you is that something that you thought about a lot when you were creating your story? I don't know. How you like the type of story, kind of like what Yehudi and Rodney were saying, like wanting to honor kind of the identity of, if it's a protagonist in your story, wanting that identity to be seen, but then to have more complexity, I guess.
I wanted to focus more on the humanity and culture more so than just race. Oftentimes, to what Yehudi was saying as well, that label of whatever the dominant culture considers, whatever the minority culture to be, becomes the thing that's interesting to them. So it becomes what the book is about. And I just I remember going to see Star Wars for the first time. And the first thing I noticed, I didn't know James Earl Jones, that was his voice because I was a kid. But everybody was white in the future, or, in a galaxy far, far away. And even when Lando was there and having the opportunity to have written Lando, it still was like such a big deal, but he was the only one. Even on the Cloud City that he was in, it still was almost like he was placed there. And you didn't get an opportunity. There were more Wookiees or more, whatever else. And so when the opportunity came to create kind of like my own little world, I wanted it to feel like what I always hoped that world would feel like, from the human part of it, the connectivity of how that character felt, what that character wanted, not so much what the outside idea of whatever oppression the culture was going through. Because I believe I work with kids a lot. I've gone back to my elementary school back home. And, when you see the influence that stories and pop culture has on kids and how they see themselves, trying to be a part of something that sort of speaks to the purity of them as human beings, not so much whatever group that they're assigned to, became a goal. I don't think consciously going into it, that's what I was thinking. I just wanted to tell a good story. But then to the question you asked before about the reaction that people have sometimes when you meet them to your work, you realize that there's more to it than that there's sort of a responsibility in there that I don't think I was as cognizant of until I started to talk to kids and talk to young people and see how they saw themselves in your work, And so I've tried to make that more of a mission, to be aware of that as I'm going through the process of making stories.
Yeah, just to quickly piggyback on what Rodney's saying, I think that's something that as an educator and as someone who's producing and also helping others produce the work, that notion, I think that's what attracts me to Afrofuturism as one aspect of Afrofuturism is kind of like reclaiming the history of the future, so to speak. Because really it's like, if you look at like science fiction and fantasy from like the 1940s, 50s, no one of color is there really, no one's there, and so you're like, what kind of like cataclysm happened? And of course you do have like Nichelle Nichols later on in Star Trek, but she, just like a lot of the other crew members, are kind of tokenized in a particular way. So it's a start, for like having a conversation about difference in the future. But one of the things I wanted to think about was when we were creating something like the Schomburg Center's Black Comic Book Festival, which I'm a co-founder of that, I'm really proud of it. But it's like, I think one of the things that we were looking at is like realigning subjectivity, because that actually also is creating a narrative, or actually creating like a space where people can interact with folk who look like them, who are producing characters that look like them. And I think that convention in Harlem has like serviced about like 60,000 kids or so, something like that. And so what's interesting is that the children who come through there for free every MLK weekend never have to know what it's like to not be subject or to be center of a narrative. And I think that's something that I'm really trying to do with Megascope as well, as far as like the type of work that I'm trying to put out into the world. And it's the kind of stuff that I want my son to see too. I think I said this in the chat, is that I've become pretty adept at dealing with dark subject matter. It's almost like it's a skill set almost. But I think post having a toddler running around the house and thinking about, legacy and future of our country and of, how we're fitting into the world, I want to make more joyous things, for future generations. So.
Yeah, thank you. That was such a good reminder. Like I went down a whole like Octavia Butler fan, like reading and listening thread. And I really liked the idea of how we can imagine the future we don't have. And so what you spoke to, it totally reminded me of that. It's like that the art gives us the opportunity to dream or create these worlds that we want to exist, even if they don't already. Mm-hmm. In terms of some of your projects, so this is maybe a little bit more technical. I know that you across the group serve different roles with the graphic novels. So we have some people who do writing, some people who do the artwork of pieces, or like have done different roles in different works. So in those cases, you're working as part of a team that is going to be consisting of people of as unique of backgrounds as every single individual has. So in those cases, how do you see what's the role of an OwnVoices contributor, I guess? Like, how does it differ if you are the writer versus an artist or a colorist or working as part of a team? Like, has it sparked conversations between the team that you've seen in terms of creating representations or story arcs? What has your experience been like if you have worked as a team?
I worked recently on for Epic Reads Cat Ninja, and that one I was just the artist. It was written by Matthew Cody, and it's a fun cat who's a ninja, like so. But when we started it, I really wanted to, because I didn't write it, but I definitely didn't want to just have sort of generic white characters populate the book, because it's like, oh, it's a ninja. Let's at least get some Asian representation in there, like at least, if we're going to be borrowing from that culture, like at least like, let's have the kids be Asian. And like, so that actually became a discussion with Epic, like a little bit of back and forth, because I kept insisting like the world should feel like, it's a fantastical world, but like, I wanted it to feel like, oh, a little Asian kid could like, watch this or read this and like feel like it's part of their world. So that was interesting.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
And I think, well, and this kind of ties in, thanks, John, to the last sort of question, is I think, that you asked sort of before you transition to this, but I think for me, I think something that happened to me a couple of years ago was that someone I knew at the place I worked at Powell's at the time, and someone came by and was just like, I was doing something, I can't remember, they saw something I had drawn and they were like, why do you just draw white people? And I was like, kind of like really, like, of course I got defensive about that because I hadn't ever thought about it. And then I realized I did. And then it made me sort of like realize, well, why am I doing that? You know what I mean? Because, and again, it's because I had framed, like my whole youth and, up until adulthood, really, and until this person asked me this question, I was in this dominant culture. It was in this, like this white dominance was in all, like everything we've been saying, right? And then so it sort of was like, well, why am I doing this? Why couldn't this person be, Vietnamese or somebody else or whatever, you know what I mean? And so like that kind of totally changed the way I approach things. And so again, kind of like Yehudi said, is when I did Wild Weather, which was, you know, is for their science series book, it's just work for hire, right? So you're like, what can I possibly do? But, you know, I was working with my friend MK, and it was this thing where I was just like, well, I'm going to make all the main characters in this book people of color. Because like, you know, she didn't have like this newscaster has to be, you know, this is this newscaster's name. This is this newscaster's name. This is the weatherman's name. And I was just like, well, I'm going to make him African-American. I'm going to make him Vietnamese. I'm going to make her Latina. You know what I mean? And so like just the opportunity of like any opportunity I have to draw people, I try to be very conscientious of like not making them white. You know what I mean? Like, and I've actually had art directors be like, actually, I really appreciate that you do that. Like, you don't even say it, or like, you know, even, or like, okay, I get an editorial illustration that's like, you know, we need a couple baking with their kids. And it's just like, okay, well, why not make those, like, make that a queer couple too, or like do something like that, just so it's like, it becomes a regular thing, right? Because like, I mean, we're all saying like, we grew up and we only saw certain people in this thing, and it wasn't until something else that clicked or realized it's like, why are we only seeing white people in Star Wars, in, you know, Scooby-Doo or things like that? And then, you know, what an amazing sort of like moment where we realize that we can sort of like change that as creators, right? And then sort of add diversity, you know, see who we want to see in our stories and images.
Yeah, on that, like I wrote and directed some straight to DVD animated series based on Trevor Romain. Trevor Romain does like self-help for kids, like how to do homework without throwing up and like stuff like that. So like, so I consciously like there was one episode where it's set in an amusement park, and I'm like, the amusement park is just this generic called Crazy World. I was like, what if we call it Loco Land? And it's a Mexican amusement park. And yeah, so like from early in my career, I was like, basically like, because you get, you know, used to the default avatar being a white man, you know, and then it's like, it takes an effort to like change everybody's thinking about it.
For us to challenge our defaults that we've inherited. Yeah. There was a question that came in the chat for Mai, if you don't mind answering it. One of the people in the audience asked, have you encountered obstacles in publishing your work, especially as a woman?
That's a really good question. So I'm pretty new to publishing. So Pilu was my debut. Before that, I was just self-publishing. So when I think about like obstacles I've encountered as a woman, I can't speak on like, you know, actual interactions I had in the publishing industry. I can talk about like personal obstacles I put in front of myself because of sort of lack of confidence or like really doubting myself. But like from a professional experience, you know, I've worked with Oni Press, which is like independent, small publishing company who was really excited to like work with me and really opened up like a career path for me. From a personal perspective, obviously dealing with like, am I worth it? Or like, am I able to do this? A lot of imposter syndrome has been the biggest blocker for me. I think in terms of like OwnVoices as well, being a mixture of Asians always makes me doubt whether the stories I'm telling or am delivering is Asian enough. And that's sort of like, you know, is it Japanese enough? Is it Vietnamese enough? Is it American enough? And in those moments, I always have to remind myself, like, I'm not here to sort of fill a educational curriculum. I'm here to tell my own story, whether that's a mix of Asian or mix of Vietnamese, Japanese, or American. So I think for me, it's been more like a personal journey of overcoming these things.
Yeah, and that was just making me think about how Rodney was talking about kind of just like getting how we can defy labels that are being imposed. And I love the fact that like, it seems like we also, besides just like when people were choosing how to express how they identify themselves, we have people who are of mixed identities, of people who don't fit neatly into any category. And so many of our kids, it's like, that's why we need as many stories as possible out there. And so that just made me think like, every story that you're creating is a new one out there for a student to discover, but we as educators also are not only encouraging our students to read and consume these creative works, but we're also really working hard to have them create and share their own stories. And so for this one, I would love to have everybody have a chance, since we're starting to get toward the end of the session. If you have any words of advice for students out there in terms of them creating their own works or words of wisdom that we can pass along, I'd love to hear from everybody. So maybe we can start with Yehudi. Are you ready to jump in?
Yeah. In fact, my nephew is in the 4th grade, and he started like really asking me like, "Hey, I want to write some comic books. I want to draw some comic books. Can you help me?" And I've been trying to, help him through that process. And basically, I told him like, make it hyper like specific to you, like like have your sister be a character, have your parents be a character, have it set in your neighborhood, like make it specific to you, and then you can get fantastical from there. Like I feel like that's a good way to start, because then like you just know like you can describe the street you live on perfectly because you live there. Like, so I told him that. And then also another thing I tell everyone who asks is just start with a small project, start it, finish it,
Yep.
tie it up in a bow, clear it off your table, then start the next one. Like the important thing is to finish a project. Like so many people start it and they think of these epic stories that are going to take 9 volumes to finish, and no, just start small, write a story, finish it, and then move on to the next one.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like, yes, getting it out. The other thing I was thinking about too, as far as like 2 pieces of advice is like, when you're working on stories, it's really the central thing should be trying to tell the best story. So if you're working on a team, if you're producing things, anything that's not necessary for the story to be the best story it can be needs to be put to the side, and that includes like ego or what have you. Because at the end of the day, everything should be in service of the story. So if that means you're going to draw it or you're going to letter it, this time around, be able to do all those things, but actually work towards creating the best narrative you can. The other thing is like, don't think that you have to do everything yourself. The idea of the lone auteur is just like a really old-fangled, westernized notion of how stories are put together. We're made out of stories, and I think that trying to create connections with people who are like-minded, trying to create community, I think is really important. So sometimes, those are the folk that are going to like carry you through like rough parts of the story or what have you. So I think like, don't just learn the circumference of your navel, you know what I'm saying? And, just get out and meet folk and actually try to find connections with community and support each other.
Yeah, that I wanted to piggyback on that real quick. Like the myth of the tortured lone creator, like that is
something new.
It doesn't, like, even Michelangelo wasn't the one chiseling, on the marble. Like it was a team of people,
Right.
like that helped him. It's like, it's sort of, and you see this now with the new Stan Lee book coming out, like, whoa, Stan Lee didn't do all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, no one, like, not one person did all that. Like he had a team around him, and he had to be like the cheerleader of it. So like maybe, yeah, he got like a lot of the credit, but I don't know. Yeah.
Learn how to collaborate, and also don't be afraid of failing safely. You know what I'm saying? Especially in school, like failure is a good teacher if you're listening and watching. So those are the other things I say. And I'm gonna stop talking.
Thank you. That's awesome. Mai?
Yeah, I just want to say I really love John's point on finding community. That has been a really eye-opening experience for me. Like the first time I went to a zine fest, specifically SF Zine Fest, I was just mind blown. Like these people who are so passionate about the most obscure things, and they make this beautiful book, and it's so exciting to collect them, and just wanting to be a part of that was very inspiring for me. I don't have like super great words of wisdom besides just like, just get started, especially trying to feel like empowered to tell an own voices type of story. I think there's a lot of mental blockers of like, is this story interesting enough? Is this too weird? But like, I always remind myself, like, you know, my individual experience and everybody else's individual experience is unique and special, but there's always people out there who can also relate to it, and like, they're thirsty for your story, and sort of fill that gap in their heart. So that would be sort of my motivational little thing for aspiring creators.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's so great too when you just hear everybody saying what you were already going to say, because it just reinforces that, like, oh, that was probably good advice if like these other people, you know, but just do, you know, I mean, finishing things, doing small things. I always tell my students, like, it's like, not that I've ever run a marathon, but I imagine hypothetically, if you don't just get off the couch and run a marathon, you train up to that marathon. And it's the same thing, like you saying, it's like everyone wants to do these like 9-volume, like fantasy space epic, but like you can't get there. Like if you can't tell a good story beginning, middle, end in 2 pages, what makes you think you're going to be able to do those 9,000 pages? But so I think that's like huge. I feel like that's what I have to keep tempering into like younger students, and there's so much value in doing a short and doing something short, and it's like not having it, you know, I mean, I'm sure all of us know, it's like you work on longer stuff, it can be like a grind, and there's something so like is so precious about being able to do short stories. But I think the other thing I would say is like, don't wait until you're good enough, because then you never are going to be like, I still, you know, like we're all talking, you know, like Maya was saying too, there's like imposter syndrome and stuff. And, you know, like I still feel like I'm not good enough at times, you know what I mean? And I'm just like, all right, someone's going to catch me, and then they're going to find out, you know what I mean? Like that I shouldn't be here. But it's just like, but I'm like, but you know what? Like, just do it. Like, just make, don't worry if you can't draw, if you can't write. Like that's how you learn, right? Is by drawing, is by writing. Like that's what I love about the work that we do, is nobody is just good at it. You have to be bad at it. You have to fail at it, right? You know, like John said, it's like that. Those are the best. Is like, and I think that's, especially when you're young, you do it. It's easier to fail and kind of pick yourself back up when you're younger. You know, like if I were to be like, okay, I'm going to go skateboard now. I'm going to learn how to skateboard. I'm going to like, you know, I die basically. You know, when you're younger, you can kind of take those hits a little bit easier.
Thank you. And Rodney.
Yeah, I'd say, you know, your experience is enough. Like the world that you're in, there's a unique story that you have to tell that no one else can tell it the way that you would tell it. So it's a worthy endeavor to go down. I'd say to write from your heart. Don't necessarily try to imitate what someone else is doing. Again, within you is the story. So if you can reach into yourself and find the things that move you and the story that you want to tell that nobody else is telling, I'd say to start there.
Those are amazing words to end on, I think. I know with young people, it's like, your story is enough. Those words that you said really stood out to me, because we want them to know that they're always enough, just as they are. I just want to thank everybody so much for joining us, for your time, for sharing your stories, that we can also, earlier up in the chat, if you missed it, there was the link to the CSLA store where you can purchase books for your library, purchase books for your own personal reading too. And also, if you scroll up further, I saw someone put in the Twitter handles for everybody, so you can follow them and continue to keep up with the work that they're doing. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody.
All right, likewise. You guys take it easy.
We'll get out the rain.
All right. Take it easy. John, I'll talk to you.
Yeah, brother. Yeah,
All right.
Shameless plugs time. Yeah, hold up the books.
Yeah, here's a book.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
All right.
See y'all later. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.